Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is our second installment. The semester goes very quickly when it's online instruction. This is only our second time doing this, and reading week is next week. So I just want to remind everyone that if you can get your reflection, your scheduled reflection in the coming week, and I will be checking my email and getting those back to you pretty much right away. They're each worth about 6%. If you put in all four over the course of two semesters, you will get 25% of your final mark um, for doing that. The key points are in the syllabus. Just hit all those, and this is not a really critical, difficult kind of thing. And as I've said many times before, I'm not looking for you to give me a mini essay. I'm not looking for you to do new work, although you're free to do that. I would like to see examples of your pastoral reflection, particularly in terms of your liturgy work. Okay, so just a reminder that we have a course schedule, and this is the first of four modules on pastoral preparation. This one being on exactly that, anticipation of the encounter and types of pastoral encounters. So what I said in the last video was that I'm looking for you to articulate a deliberate or intentional form for your pastoral encounters. And that's somewhat counterintuitive. People would say, well, you just let it flow, whatever. And I think that probably you're involved in some kind of a method, even if you don't realize it. And it's probably good to be aware of that and to draw that out as much as possible. There's a flaw to doing this. There's a flaw to being intentional. And eventually I would expect it to become more spontaneous. But in the meantime, trying to hone what you do in terms of being intentional and deliberate. The flaw is basically that when we start to articulate something in terms of intention or plan, that we're basically dealing with it as if it's scientific, technological. And science and technology is one thing, but what we're engaged in is relational. And as I recently heard, as a line in a movie actually, is that science and technology are engaged in the deliberate application of nouns to phenomena. Um, and nouns hold things separate, but relationships are very verbal, and often transitive verbs at that. So there's a break point here that doesn't apply. But nevertheless, I had a poster in my office many years ago, and in block letters it says, first we learn to do it right, and then in script it said, then we learn to do it loose. And that's what we're trying to do here, is going from deliberate and intentional to spontaneous and relational. It's a bit of a step back for many of you. I'm sure that many of you have already had lots of experience in this and do very well. So in this video, we're going to talk about pastoral preparation, anticipation of the encounter, types of pastoral encounters, and presenting versus actual issues. For those of you with a counseling or psychology background, most of this will not be unfamiliar, although you would have heard it articulated in different ways. Now, first of all, I'm going to ask a simple question, is what are some varieties of pastoral encounter? And I'm going to leave that question with you. As usual, the question contains its own answers. But we have different ways of being pastoral in different situations, whether it is from the pulpit on Sunday morning, when we are engaged in the first and last pastoral event of every week, or when we are at a meeting and things are being said that are untruthful, deliberately manipulative, power plays, or passive interference, passive manipulation. How are we pastoral in those kinds of engagements, as well as moments of celebration and grief and frustration? So the first thing I'm going to touch upon is the notion of a pastoral plan. When we are called to the hospital floor, to the funeral home, to a scene of a suicide, and over the course of a career that might span 30 years, you were going to engage in those things. When we are called to a place of great grief or called to a place of some celebration. It used to happen a lot more often than it does today, but the minister often got a call when a baby was born, and we were expected to and would go to the hospital to visit the new mothers and fathers um, at that time. So when I took CPE, when I took my supervised pastoral education at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, Toronto, which some of you may realize is a huge facility, I was under the supervision of this little genius named Alan Tipping. And he would emphasize this idea of we would not just walk down the hall and into the room and engage. That on the way, we would be thinking about what we were going to do. We would have a pastoral plan. So, for instance, some years ago, I used to play at a bar regularly, and I was one of the few non-bluegrass players there. And one evening, the banjo player of one of the bluegrass bands walked out behind me as I was leaving, and this was very unusual. And I knew that he was a new grandfather, so I congratulated him. And he thanked me and said, "That's what I'm here to talk about. The baby's not going to live long, and we would like you to come and baptize the baby when it's time." Now, we are encouraged to respond to these requests in extremis, with imminent mortality scratching at the door, in the positive. That's not something you have to go back to your worship committee and ask about or anything like that. You say yes. And so I did, and he said, "I'll give you a call when we want you." And sometime later, maybe 2 weeks later, I was home after work and I was alone. I was planning to fix myself some supper. It was raining. I had changed my clothes to work a bathroom that I was redoing, and the phone rang. And so at 6 o'clock in the evening, I had to drive into Toronto, and about I guess I'd say an hour drive in the rain at rush hour. And changed my clothes, and I was in the car, and I was on my way. And first of all, I realized that I'd never driven to Children's Hospital before. I'd always taken the subway, and I didn't know how to get there. And this is before GPSs. This is before I had one anyway. So I set that aside in my worry bin and started planning what I was going to do, because I didn't want to stand there with a book and a bunch of papers. I wanted to be able to be spontaneous. I wanted to plan to be spontaneous. So I practiced the Lord's Prayer. I practiced singing Psalm 23. I practiced the things that I would say. Oddly enough, I drove directly to the hospital. I had more trouble finding a parking spot than I did getting to the hospital. And when I was there with a totally non-church family, I was able to be there fully with them because I had a plan. You know, I knew what they wanted from me. I stayed till about 3 in the morning until Grandpa made it clear to me that they weren't going to pull the plug with me there, but thanked me very much for my participation. We became very close friends and still are. This is what happens. These don't always work out. You know, you don't always. Your pastoral plan can be scuttled very quickly. You can walk into a funeral interview, for instance, and find there's at least one hostile member of the family there. A person who's hostile to the presence of a clergy person, maybe hostile to the presence of a female clergy person. I found it was not unusual for somebody to say, "We don't want no mention of Jesus." That was a bottom line with me. I don't overdo it, but I'm a Christian minister. You can't expect a Christian minister to come and be something else. And that always worked out. You know, I'd be gentle about my affirmation, and we'd move on. Sometimes the people who you're supposed to encounter don't show up, and you have to track them down. Like the woman who wanted to arrange baptism for her granddaughter, who was her legal ward, and we'll talk about that in sacraments another time. And she just didn't show up. So I phoned and got her on the phone and asked her if she had forgotten the appointment. And she had just gotten home from the doctors and had found out that she had terminal cancer. So the encounter became something else. So how do you form a pastoral plan? That's your second question for this week to go on Bright Spot Space. And you don't have to answer all these questions, just some of them. The third area I'd like to go is in the area of pastoral assessment. I find this is most useful in funeral preparation, but very often when I'm visiting, when I'm doing home visits, which a lot of ministers don't do anymore for reasons of vulnerability, especially the first time, it's worth it to keep the spotlight off myself. They're free to ask me questions, but I'm there to find out about them and to see what their lives are like. And so I learned from the aforementioned Reverend Tipping that most people's lives are concerned with 6 aspects. And we remember them with a little almost nonsensical saying, people seek comfort from kind friends. People seek comfort from kind friends. And those stand for different things. The first one, the P in people, stands for people. Who are the people in this person's life? What was her husband's name? How long were they married? How many children does she have? What is his relationship to his workmates? Who has been part of this person's life? Either the person in front of you or the person who's deceased or whatever's there. The second, seek, the S stands for space. What kinds of spaces did the person like to be in? Where did she or he work? Where was she born? Where was she raised? Where did he live over the span of his adulthood? The spaces. What kinds of spaces did he like to be in? When my father died, the minister tried very, very hard to get to know my dad by asking continuously about his hobbies. My father never had a hobby. My dad liked to work. He liked to work all the time. I can't even say, quintessentially, he just was justified by work, product. And it took forever for us to get around to saying, well, he liked to be out in his boat. Because it had been over 20 years since he was able to do that. But he loved being on the lake in the boat. That was about the only non-work thing he ever did. That was a space he liked to be in. And personally, I can launch an entire sermon, a funeral sermon, on the basis of that alone. So think about that. Comfort. People seek comfort. Just hang on a second.